Well, thanks everybody for coming here on this on Super Bowl Sunday. It's very glad you all could make it. And my name is Jeff Friedman, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm a PhD candidate here at Nova in marriage and family therapy. The topic here today is one that's of an interest of mine. It's really looking at the phenomenon of school shootings from the perspective of gender. And typically when there's a school shooting, and unfortunately these don't seem to be going away, there's often this alarming that we need to talk about mental health issues. And while this is very important, gender is something I think that's often overlooked in this conversation. The other conversation that they talk about is gun control, and that's also very important, and I have my own beliefs on these two issues, but today's talk is about gender. So, when we're talking about gender, I think one of the big things that we need to talk about is this culture of patriarchy. And there's been a lot of great strides with the feminist movement, and I think women have really been progressing and getting their voice, but when you talk about feminism or masculinity, they're always connected to each other, and I feel this culture of patriarchy is not often talked about enough. Particularly, I don't know if anybody's familiar with this concept of the man box, but there was this great TED Talk by this guy, Tony Porter, about it that made it more well-known. And it's basically, and I think almost every boy, male, growing up in America has some relationship to this. And I can talk from my own experience growing up. I'm Jewish, and I remember my father told me that I couldn't get my hair cut before my bar mitzvah because it was like girly, that I wanted to into grooming and looking good, which now I think about is really ridiculous, and I think it comes from these kinds of ideas. And another example of my own personal experience is as a therapist at a drug treatment center in Fort Lauderdale. And I remember it happened more than one time. A lot of the kids would come in and be crying in me in my office with them. And they were ashamed to show their tears in public, so they would make sure that they looked all cool before they went out and were with all the other peers for fear they'd be ridiculed or even engaged in a fight, a violent fist fight type of thing. And there's all these cultural metaphors about what it is to be a man. It's like to be strong and not ask for directions and not show any weakness. And it's pretty problematic because most people, even the really masculine men, don't fit into all this criteria and have moments of weakness, and they feel that they don't feel comfortable expressing their more classically feminine parts of themselves. And this is an academic concept called hegemonic masculinity, which is really more of a fancy way for saying this really hyper-dominant form of masculinity. And if you look at analyze a lot of school shootings, predominantly the school shootings have been done, perpetrators have been male. Now, more recently, there have been some females that have engaged in this kind of behavior. But if you analyze the different incidences, most of the shooters have had incidences that they've been ridiculed and teased for failing to live up to this classical hyper-masculine notion. And it's also interesting that even though that they're often called gay, it's not even so much about their sexual orientation, it's more about their gender identity or gender performance, that they're not asking and they're not behaving in a very masculine way. So we look at males, or the research shows, there's a lot of statistics on this, that our males are much more resorting to violence as an acceptable means of conflict resolution. And this is a quote by a sociologist named Irving Goffman from the 1960s, but I still think it is very relevant today. And I want to particularly bring attention the bottom part in red, that basically any man that doesn't feel that they live up to this hegemonic form of masculinity, they feel inadequate at times, and also particularly emotion that often comes up with is shame. And because of that, not just violence, I think a lot of men resort to drug addiction or like a lot of high-risk sexual behavior to deal with these, not living up to this notion of what a man should be. And this is another concept that's talked about in the literature. It's called aggrieved entitlement, and that's this concept that it's also particularly more so white Caucasian males. They feel that they're entitled to wealth and success and pretty women, and they feel if they're not able to obtain this, something's wrong. And then often in a lot of in video games and other movies and stuff, it's sort of glorified that violence is a way to sort of reclaim your manhood. And the great gender theorist Eminem has some interesting words on this subject as well. That the lowest degrading thing you can say to a man when you're battling him is to call him a faggot, and try to take away his manhood. Call him a sissy, call him a punk. Faggot to me doesn't necessarily mean gay people. Faggot to me means taking away your manhood. And again, I mean, this really highlights this point that it's the word, faggot is a pejorative term, demeaning and to homosexual people, but in this case, it's really more about not fitting into this gendered, hegemonic form of masculinity rather than their sexual preference. In Columbine High School, this was sort of the school shooting that I remember the most when I was growing up in the 1990s, and it fit all these kinds of characteristics, and these kids were boys that didn't fit in. And if you really look at analyze it, they don't really seem like the boys were necessarily gay, or they just didn't fit into this man box, if you will. And so the blaze of glory, this is a metaphor that's shown a lot in video games and violent movies, and most of these shootings, that the people that commit them, they go out in a blaze of glory, and that's sort of a very masculine kind of thing. I mean, in terms of this hegemonic, hyper-masculine archetype. And often, like it says here too, that men and boys often engage in numbing themselves with drug or alcohol to cope with these feelings of not fitting in. So this word teshuva is a Hebrew word that means returning, and I believe that men, boys, and women too. I mean, we both have male and feminine characteristics. We both have testosterone and estrogen, man or woman. And but I really think we'd be much better off as a society if we return more to these values of compassion, love, empathy. I think that's really our original nature. That I think the way some of the economic structures are set up to assume more of this dominating kind of hyper-masculine position, I think both women too need to recognize this. And really what I think what holds us together as a society is a concern for others. And instead of looking at these problems when another school shooting happens, seeing what's wrong with these individuals, that there's something psychologically wrong with them. I mean, I think gun control is a real big issue and should be addressed, but still think about us as society and thinking about how we raise boys and men, and even how sometimes women I feel are encouraged to take in more of a dominating male kind of role. And I wanted to say that my last name is Friedman, and that happens to mean man of peace in German. So I'm really hoping that we're going to have more of a peaceful world once people shift from their thinking and stuff. And I see a lot of good things happening. That I think one of the things is people are getting much more into meditation and mindfulness, and it helps the people have more concern for their own emotions and concern for others. And if you're interested in these kinds of topics, there's a few different organizations. One called the Good Men Project. There's another one called the Mankind Project that are sort of involved with promoting a more healthier form of masculinity. And there's another good movie, a documentary called The Masculinity that really tackles a lot of these issues. Well, thank you.